The buggy came home slower than it went out. I remember that. The horse knew the road, and I let the reins go loose in my hands because I did not have the strength to hold them tight. We had just buried his mother. The dirt was still under my fingernails. My black dress smelled like other people's kitchens, like the food 200 mourners had eaten in my yard 3 hours earlier. And beside me on that bench, my husband was quiet in a way I had learned to be afraid of. Then he told me what he expected when we got home. Not tomorrow, not after the mourning week. That night. On the day we put his mother in the ground. Before I tell you what he demanded and why I did not believe I was allowed to say no, let me introduce myself. My name is Martha. I grew up Old Order Amish in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and this is Hannah the Amish Girl, the channel where I share the things we were never permitted to say out loud. If you want the truth about plain life from someone who actually lived inside it, not the postcard version the tourists buy, subscribe, and tap the like button. And tell me in the comments, before you hear the rest, what do you think a grieving man is allowed to ask of his wife the same day he loses his mother? I want to know what you imagine, because I promise you, the reality is stranger than that. Let me explain something outsiders never understand about an Amish funeral, because you cannot understand what happened on that buggy bench without first understanding the day that came before it. When someone dies in our community, the whole district stops. The men dig the grave by hand, taking turns with the shovels, and no machine ever touches that soil. The women cook for days. There is no funeral home, no professional to stand between you and the body. The dead are washed and dressed by their own family. My mother-in-law was laid out in the front room of the house she had lived in for 40 years, in a plain wooden coffin built by men who had known her since she was a girl. There were no flowers. We do not do flowers. There was no eulogy the way English people mean it, no one standing up to say what a wonderful woman she was, because to praise a person that way is considered prideful, even in death. There was only scripture, and singing from the ausbund in that slow, unaccompanied way that sounds like a sound coming up out of the ground itself. For 3 days people came. Hundreds of them. Buggies lined the lane for half a mile, and the wife, the daughter-in-law, that was me. I did not sit and grieve. I served. I carried coffee until my arms ached. I refilled bowls. I washed the cups of people whose names I barely knew, and I did it with my eyes down, because that is what a good Amish woman does on the worst day of another person's life. Her own feelings come last, if they come at all. I loved that woman. She had taught me how to can peaches, and how to quiet a colicky baby, and how to keep my mouth shut when my husband was in a mood. And I was not permitted on the day we buried her to sit down and cry for her for even 10 minutes, because there were pans to fill and men to feed and a household to run. My grief was a luxury the day could not afford. I want you to hold that picture in your mind, because by the time Amos and I climbed into that buggy to ride home, I had been on my feet for 3 days. I had barely slept. I had cried exactly twice, both times in the pantry with the door shut, wiping my face on my apron before anyone could see. That is the woman who was sitting on that bench, emptied out, scraped down to nothing. That is the woman my husband turned to. Here is what the Ordnung, our unwritten code, teaches a woman about her place, and I need you to understand these 3 things or none of the rest will make sense. The first thing is that a wife submits, not sometimes, not when it is convenient, always. The vow I made was not a vow to love, it was a vow to yield. The bishop who married us did not talk about my happiness. He talked about Ephesians. He talked about the wife submitting to the husband as to the Lord. I was 19. I thought that word, submit, meant helping, cooking, keeping a clean house. It took me years to learn how much more that word was allowed to mean. The second thing is that a husband's needs are never questioned. Not by the church, not by the community, and least of all by his wife. Whatever he requires, whenever he requires it, the assumption is that a faithful woman provides it without complaint. Complaint itself is the sin, Not the demand, the complaint. There was no one I could have gone to. If I had walked to the bishop and told him what was asked of me on the day of the funeral, the bishop would not have asked my husband a single question. He would have asked me whether I had been rebellious. He would have reminded me of my vow. The whole machinery of the community was built to point back at the woman, always, and to ask what she had done to bring the trouble on herself. There is no word in our world for a wife who was wronged by her own husband inside her own marriage. That category does not exist, and a thing that has no name cannot be spoken, and a thing that cannot be spoken cannot be stopped. The third thing is that grief in our world is not something you are allowed to indulge. Suffering is holy. Endurance is faith. To ask for gentleness, to say I am tired, I am hurting, I have nothing left to give tonight, that is treated as weakness. Worse, it is treated as pride, hochmut, the greatest sin of all. Because who are you to think your exhaustion matters more than your duty? We are taught from the time we are small girls that the self is the enemy, that every want you have is a temptation to be crushed. So when my body was telling me, that night, that I had nothing left, I did not hear a body asking for mercy. I heard a temptation asking to be resisted. That is how deep it goes. They do not just take away your right to say no. They rewire you so that your own exhaustion feels like sin, so that the very thing that should protect you becomes one more thing to be ashamed of. Put those three things together, and you begin to see the trap I was sitting in on that buggy bench. A wife who must yield. A husband who cannot be questioned. And a grief that I was not permitted to claim as a reason for anything. We had been married 11 years by then. His name was Amos. And I want to be fair to him, because this story is not as simple as a cruel man and a frightened woman, though there was fear in it. Amos was not a monster. He was a man raised by the same silence that raised me. He had watched his own father treat his mother a certain way, and he had never once been told there was another way to be. On the day of the funeral, he had just lost the woman who bore him. He was hollowed out. And when a man like that reaches for the only comfort he has ever been taught to reach for, he does not think of it as a demand. He thinks of it as his right. That is what makes it so hard to explain to people on the outside. The cruelty was not personal, it was structural. It was built into the walls of the house before either of us was born. The buggy turned onto our lane. The sun was going down over the corn we had not had time to worry about all week. And Amos said the words plainly, the way you would ask someone to pass the salt. He said he needed me tonight. He said a man should not sleep alone the day he buries his mother. He said it was my duty to comfort him, and he named exactly what he meant by comfort. And there was no softness in it, no acknowledgement that I had spent 3 days on my feet, that I was grieving too, that I had loved his mother like my own. There was only the assumption, calm and total, that whatever he needed, I would provide. And here is the part I am ashamed to tell you. My first feeling was not anger. My first feeling was calculation. I began, sitting right there on that bench with the dirt still under my nails, to work out how to get through it, not whether to refuse. It did not occur to me that refusing was a thing a woman in my position could do. I simply started planning how to endure it, the way I had planned how to endure so many things. That is what a lifetime of that teaching does to you. It removes the question before you ever get to ask it. There is a part of this story I cannot tell you here. Not on this platform. Not under these rules. The algorithm has limits, and I have learned exactly where they are. So I wrote the rest down instead, slowly, without the softening, without the cuts. Everything the camera is not permitted to show. The book is called The Ordnung They Never Wrote Down. 208 pages of what plain life looks like from the inside of it. The link is in the first comment of this video. That is where the part I could not say out loud lives. What I can tell you is what happened after. Because the after is where I finally began to understand the size of what I had been living inside. The next morning I got up before dawn, the way I always did. There were still dishes from the funeral. There were still casserole pans that belonged to other women, each one needing to be washed and returned. And as I stood at that basin with the cold water running over my hands, something in me had changed. Not loudly, not all at once. It was more like a small crack in a foundation you do not notice until the whole wall shifts. I stood there, and for the first time in 11 years, I let myself think a thought I had never allowed. I thought that should not have been asked of me. Not that night. Not like that. And the thought did not feel like pride. It felt like the truth. But I want to be honest with you about how slow this was, because I do not want you to think a woman wakes up one morning and simply knows. I did not. For weeks after that night I told no one, and I thought I was the only one. I thought there was something wrong with me for feeling what I felt. I remembered my own mother. I remembered watching her, all those years, get up in the dark and serve my father, and never once, not one time in my whole childhood, did I see her say she was tired. I had thought that was strength. I had wanted to be like that. Standing at that basin, I understood for the first time that it might not have been strength at all. It might have been a woman who had also had the question removed from her before she ever got to ask it. And that thought made me grieve for her almost more than for the woman we had just buried. Because my mother-in-law's suffering was over. My mother's was still going on, in a house 3 miles down the road every single morning, and she did not even know there was another way for it to be. I want to tell you about a woman named Rebecca, because she is the reason I ever let myself think it at all. Rebecca was older than me, in her 60s, a widow, and she was the kind of woman the bishops watched carefully because she had opinions and did not always keep them behind her teeth. A few days after the funeral, she came to help me return the pans. We were driving her buggy down a back road, just the two of us, and I do not know what made me say it. Grief, maybe. Exhaustion. But I told her. Not everything, just enough. I told her what had been asked of me on the day we buried my mother-in-law, and I waited for her to tell me I was being prideful, to remind me of my vows. She did not. She was quiet for a long moment, watching the road, and then she said something I have carried every day since. She said, "They teach us that submission has no bottom to it, that there is no floor, that there is nothing a woman is allowed to say no to, because the saying no is itself the sin." And then she looked at me and she said, "But there is a floor, Martha. They just never showed us where it was, because a woman who knows where the floor is a woman they cannot fully own." I did not have words for what that did to me. It was like someone handing you a map to a country you had lived in your whole life and never once been allowed to see drawn out. There was a floor. There were things that could be too much. My exhaustion was not pride. My grief was not weakness. The problem had never been that I felt these things. The problem was that I had been taught every single day of my life that feeling them made me a bad woman. Rebecca had been married for 40 years to a man who, she told me, had learned in his old age to ask instead of demand. But it had taken her decades, and it had taken a kind of quiet rebellion she had waged so carefully that no bishop ever caught her at it. She had learned to say, "Not tonight," in a voice that carried no complaint, only fact. And she told me that the first time she said it, she was so afraid she shook, and nothing happened. The sky did not fall. Her husband was angry, and then he was not. And slowly, over years, he came to understand that she was a person and not a tool that comfort came out of. Most women, she said, never get to find that out. They go their whole lives believing the floor is not there. She told me about her own mother next, and her voice got very low, the way ours did when we spoke of things that were not supposed to be spoken. She said her mother had died young, worn down to nothing by 14 children and a husband who never once considered that her body might have a limit. She said she had watched her mother be buried and had promised herself standing at that grave that she would find the floor if it took her whole life. And it had nearly taken her whole life. That is the thing I want you to understand about how these communities hold. It is not that no woman ever sees the truth. Some do. But the seeing comes so late, and it comes so alone, and it comes with such fear attached to it, that by the time a woman finds the floor, she is often already old, already worn, already most of the way through the only life she was ever going to get. Rebecca found hers at 50. Her mother never found hers at all. And I was sitting on a buggy at 30, being handed the map early, and I did not yet know what a rare and dangerous gift that was. She said one more thing to me before she let me down at my lane. She said, "Do not tell the young ones this in the open. Tell them the way I am telling you, sideways, in a buggy, where no one can hear, because the moment they know we are passing this between us, they will find a way to stop it." And I have thought about that so many times since, that the truth in that world does not travel down from the pulpit or across the dinner table. It travels sideways, woman to woman, in whispers. The way water finds a crack. It is the only way it can survive. I think about all the women who never had a Rebecca. That is the part that turns my grief into something harder. Because what happened to me on that buggy bench was not rare. It was the water we all swam in. Every woman I grew up with was taught the same 3 things. Yield always. Never question him. And never ever let your own suffering become a reason. Multiply that across every farmhouse in every district, across generations of women who buried parents and children and still got up the next morning to serve, and you begin to see that this was never about one man on one bench. It was a system doing exactly what it was built to do. When I finally left, years later, the cost was everything they promised it would be. The shunning came down like a door closing. Letters returned unopened. My mother would not speak my name on the telephone. The community that had shown up with 300 casseroles when Amos's mother died would not show up for me at all because I had committed the one unforgivable sin. I had decided my own life was mine. In therapy, on the outside, I learned words I had never been given. The word consent. The word coercion. The idea that a yes given by a woman who does not believe no is available to her is not really a yes at all. My therapist said something once that I have never forgotten. She said, "Control does not always announce itself. Sometimes it looks like a woman who cannot even imagine refusing and calls that peace." And I sat in that office and I wept. Not for that one night on the buggy bench, but for the girl at 19 who took a vow she did not understand, and for every woman still out there who thinks the floor is not there. I do not tell this story to make you hate the Amish. The plain world gave me things I will carry until I die. A community with a depth most people will never know. Hands that could build a barn in a day. A faith that, wounded as it is, still lives somewhere in me. But I will not pretend that a tradition is holy just because it is old. There is no scripture that requires a grieving woman to have nothing of her own. There is no God I believe in now who built a woman's body and then decided her exhaustion did not count. There is no covenant that has no floor. If you grew up in a world where your yes was assumed before you ever opened your mouth, I see you. If you were taught that your own tiredness, your own grief, your own body were things you were not allowed to speak for, I see you, and I am telling you now what no one told me. The floor is there. It was always there. They only hid it from you because a woman who knows where it is a woman they cannot own. If you want to read the version of this story that YouTube will not allow, the full pages are in the Ordnung they never wrote down. First comment of this video, and that is everything. Choose your freedoms wisely. They might just save your life.